Great. Looks like we're getting folks into the room. So while we work on queuing up our speaker for the day, getting his video on, just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us this morning for what we expect will be a very interesting conversation with author Max Brooks. And on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. I hope that everybody had a safe, healthy, and reflective Memorial Day weekend. And thank you for getting right back into the week with us on Tuesday morning. And I want to thank Mr. Brooks for joining us. I believe he's on West Coast time, so thank you for joining us on the early side in Los Angeles. We're going to get into the conversation soon, but I just wanted to say how appropriate this conversation is for some of the things we've been looking at CSPC recently, some of the decision making, some of the planning challenges that are presented by a global pandemic. And probably like many of the participants in the audience today, I recently rewatched World War Z along with a number of other films that had to do with pandemics or other crises and how societies and government systems respond to these crises, and find continually that these works of fiction are actually extremely appropriate in terms of analyzing how we respond to events like the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is a very interesting opportunity for us to apply works of fiction to analyze real world challenges that we face today, and also to help us think ahead about how to prepare better for things that may be coming around the corner that we can't quite foresee. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk to Max Brooks this morning about his process, his thinking, how he's used a study through a fictional lens in a way to help us think through some of these processes that we can apply to the challenges facing our country.
Am I unmuted?
There you are. Great. We can hear you now. Good
there
morning.
we go. There we go. All right. Okay.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for joining us and for being with us on the early side today. If you're in LA, I know it's kind of early for you.
That's all right. My son had to get up early for school anyway, so it's not a problem.
Okay, great. Well, we really appreciate you being with us today. We've got a great audience of folks, mostly from the DC area, many of whom are engaged with us on discussions that have to do with various areas of national security. Almost everybody is in both a planning and react kind of vocation. And so we're very curious to hear your thoughts on how we can maybe broaden our minds a little bit and think about a better approach to both foreseeable and unforeseeable challenges and crises. Obviously, we're all kind of reeling from the current pandemic, but you might say that there's a lot of things that we should have known, that we could have brought into this, that we hadn't, because of whether it's a lack of imagination, lack of planning, whatever it is. Max, thank you. Why don't I just turn it over to you and let you share some thoughts with us about your process and what you've learned along the way, and then we'll provide an opportunity for Dan to field some questions from the audience. Let me just remind the audience, you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can go ahead and submit the question anytime while Mr. Brooks is talking. But Max, thank you again for being with us. And let me just turn it over to you and let you tell us what you're thinking.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thanks for giving me the time. Let me just start by saying, as far as this pandemic, this was not a failure of imagination, not at all. Pandemics have been with us since day one, since the moment we climbed out of the trees. This was a failure of courage and compassion and competence. There is no excuse. There is absolutely no excuse for what's happening. Oh, look, here's the actual plan. Here's the National Response Framework. Here's the Biological Incident Annex. So no. You can't blame COVID-19 on a failure of imagination. We were ready. We had a plan. We have people trained for this. There's no excuse. However, there are other threats out there, new threats innovative threats that we are not prepared for, that we haven't even considered. You could very well say that 9/11 was a failure of imagination, as are many sucker punches that we've suffered in the last couple of decades, because boy, nobody gets sucker punched like us. You could even say that we have an imagination gap with our enemies, the same way we had a missile gap with the Soviets in the 1960s. They're out thinking us. They're out innovating us. The Chinese, the Iranians, non-state actors. As a Gen Xer, I can tell you that in my lifetime, I've never seen NATO so close to being destroyed by Ivan. And Ivan's doing it without firing a shot. They're using cyber. They're using information warfare. They're using proxy war. They're using economic war. They're combining this all. We're not allowed to call it the Gerasimov doctrine anymore. Even the journalist who coined the term said, sorry, didn't mean that. But our enemies are masters of creative thinking, and we are not. And I have seen two reasons for this. And this is not from the Atlantic Council or the Modern War Institute. This is just as an outsider's point of view. I can tell you that one of the reasons is simple, the trap of success. And that's just human history. Whenever a civilization gets to a certain level of success, they think, well, we got here by doing certain things a certain way. Let's just keep doing it that way. And not wanting to innovate, because look how we got here. And we saw that in Desert Storm, which I think is the most disastrous war we ever fought. And I say this because we thought we were teaching the world a lesson. We thought that if we could have a good set piece World War II maneuver war battle, then we could say to the rest of the world, don't screw with us, because if you meet us on the battlefield, we'll destroy you. That's what we thought the lesson was. We didn't realize the lesson was, hey, don't attack America on the battlefield. Find new and inventive and creative ways of going around that new Maginot Line. And they have. We pushed our enemies into asymmetry. We have forced them to be creative thinkers. And they've got at least a 20-year head start on us. So that's one reason. Another reason is just the simple rules of the success game. Not just in this country, but in many countries. And that is the Prussian model of education. The idea that memorization and then regurgitation to a ticking clock. That's how you advance in our society. You take in a ton of information, you hold it in your head just long enough to spit it back out on a piece of paper while there's a clock ticking. And then if you can do that correctly, you move up. And that is why we all have met people who are successes who cannot think, because they were never trained to think. They were trained to memorize. That is the Prussian model of education. And by the way, it also filters down even into entertainment. What is the main way that young people are entertained? Video games. And that's been the case since I was a kid in the 1980s. But how are most video games laid out? There's one way to succeed, and then when you do it, you get bumped up a level. That's brain training at the very basic level. So between school and entertainment, our brains have been trained to be very logical and very methodical, but not very creative. And that is obviously a tremendous problem. But that I don't recommend that change completely. You don't want a society of just thinkers and creators and daydreamers. Nothing would ever get done. You need people to think practically and logically. So creativity, innovation has to have its place, but it has to have a specific place. And what I have spoken to many times, or what I've lectured to West Point cadets about, is you don't have to be a creative thinker. What you have to do is be a champion of creativity. And that's critical in the creative process, because good ideas happen all the time. But if nobody gets behind them, if nobody sticks their neck out and says, that's a good idea and I'm willing to risk my reputation on it, then the ideas die. So we don't need a society just of Greek philosophers. What you need is a society of Romans Roman engineers, Roman soldiers, Roman architects, who then look at the Greeks and say, that's a good idea. We should do that. That is the role of creativity, certainly in policy, when it comes to government policy. You need champions of innovative thought. But that doesn't go far enough because we live in a republic. And this is what I have witnessed in the last decade between the Atlantic Council, between the Naval War College, between the Modern War Institute, going to all these conferences. I see a lot of really smart people, but I don't see a lot of great communication with the voters, because I will go to these conferences and I'll see these amazing ideas, and then I'll go back to my hotel room and I'll turn on the news and I won't see one of those ideas anywhere. Because it doesn't matter how creative you are, it doesn't matter how innovative and how brilliant you are, if you're not able to make the voter, the taxpayer, understand the value of these ideas. And you don't need to go forward with that, you need to go back. Because in World War II and the early Cold War, we were masters of this. The United States government harnessed this incredible natural resource that America had, which is its storytellers, and got them on board and said, listen, you need to explain to the American people why we fight. There literally was remember this? There was a show, Why We Fight. Now, it's not so simple anymore. The world is much more complex, and you can't just throw out education and ideas. More importantly, when you tell the public a story, you've got to do it right. And what I mean by right is you cannot trip the ego defense mechanism. For example, if you're going to tell a story about a Russian cyber hack that is going to shut everything down in America, and planes will fall out of the sky, and hospital ventilators will shut down, cars will crash into each other. If you're going to tell that story, which we all know could happen, if it's too real, if you force people to see themselves in a story they're not ready to see, you trip the ego defense mechanism and people shy away. You scare them off. And that's normal, that's human. So what you do is you give them a psychological condom, which is science fiction or horror. You give them an imaginary monster, but you give them real world solutions. Because if your threat is fictional, that's just enough for people to be able to come on the ride with you. And they go, oh, this is fun, this is exciting. And if you impregnate your fictional story with real world facts, then you've educated them without them even knowing. And, you know, I'd love to be able to toot my own horn and say like, oh, well, I did it in Zombie Survival Guide, World War Z, my new book, Devolution. It's about Bigfoot, but it's really about natural disasters. Yeah, great. But everything I've done cannot hold a candle to what I think the greatest potential success story certainly in the last 20 years, which is the Center for Disease Control's zombie protection website. This was an act of not just brilliance, but courage. The fact that the Center for Disease Control actually had a zombie preparedness website up, and it was so successful, it crashed the server. That's how many people were excited by this. And it was not just having a laugh. This was a pandemic preparedness website, and they knew that. But if they put up a pandemic preparedness website, how many people were going to log on? Maybe nobody. One wonk in a basement in DC. So instead, they just made it zombies. But in your zombie kit that you would need to fight this fictional plague was everything you would really need to survive an actual pandemic. That's how you do it. That's the success model right there. The problem was they didn't have champions. And this goes back to what I said in the beginning. They didn't have enough people with enough power behind them to stick their neck out and say, this is what we should be doing across the board. Not only should this zombie preparation website have the full resources and the full support of the federal government, but we should be thinking of ways to copy this model in everything we do. Find a fictional threat and tackle it with an actual solution. And that way we educate the public. Because had that happened for this plague, not only would more people be in a physically better preparation state, they also would have been in a better psychological preparation state. Because we all know phase one of any disaster is panic. People have never thought about it. They've never thought this could happen. Then suddenly it does happen. And in the time it takes to suddenly ramp up to prepare, people lose their minds. That's just human psychology. If that CDC website had been in every home constantly for the last, I don't know how many years, we would have had a lot less panic, and maybe a lot more lives could have been saved. This is the value of creativity. This is what happens when you match the Greek daydreamer with the Roman engineer. That's when you get success. And that's what we need. We need the model of creativity championed by those in power to help better psychologically prepare our public for what will come at them. That's all I got to say.
Get myself unmuted here. Thank you. Well, thank you again for being with us and for sharing those thoughts with us. I like that term, the ego, avoiding tripping the ego defense mechanism. I think we use the term quite often in politics. I use the term landmines. You got to be careful not to step on the verbal landmine or the trigger word or whatever it is that causes the political defense to go up, and that's the end of the conversation. Right after that, there's nothing else penetrates because you've signaled the person that you're on the other side of some issue, and that's it. So I really like that, not triggering the ego defense mechanism. But I'm wondering if I can start by asking kind of a really broad question, and I want to ask you if you might comment a little bit on both. If you would talk a little bit about World War Z and kind of the process of developing that idea and how you got from sort of the idea to choosing the subject matter, and then what you tried to infuse in that in terms of delivering some kind of thoughtful educational outcome. And the second part of my question is I wanted you to talk a little bit more about devolution. And I will note that one of our trustees here at the center, Tom Ridge, who was the former Secretary of Homeland Security, said in response to your book, "I wish we could all elevate the national dialogue on public safety to a level of tone and focus that Max Brooks has demonstrated for all of us." So Tom Ridge has made this connection, but can you help our audience think, tell us a little bit about your process on both of these books so that we, can get some key takeaways from them.
Well, before talking about these books, let me start with my first book, The Zombie Survival Guide. Very, very simple. It is a preparedness manual for a zombie attack, and it was my first book, and I wrote it in the 90s for me because I didn't think anybody else was going to be interested. But it started with a very simple premise. I was a kid, I was scared of zombies, and I thought, what if there were really zombies? But I thought, what if there were really zombies? But that was the only thing that had come into this world. What if I had to stop a zombie attack with everything around me? I'm not the star of a movie. I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a magic potion. All I have is what's in the real world. And by thinking about it, I was able, without meaning to, because I'm incredibly OCD, I peeled back the onion layers of a zombie attack, which made me realize that if it was real, most people would die without ever having seen a zombie, because the real threat of a zombie attack, like the real threat of an earthquake or a pandemic or even a war, is the second and third order effects, not the people who die from direct enemy contact. The people who die because enemy contact has wiped out the survival net that keeps us all happy and safe and not in the Middle Ages. So in Zombie Survival Guide, I realized how many people, for every one person who dies of a zombie bite, how many people would die of dehydration, malnutrition, just starvation, accidents, other diseases, secondary and tertiary diseases. Because once you break that health net, how many other things are going to come roaring back? How many poor people died in Haiti of cholera because of the earthquake? So by looking at that, I realized that surviving a threat needed a holistic response, not just a response of firepower. You needed to think of all the angles. And so by outlining the zombie survival guide, without meaning to, I had completed an actual disaster preparedness manual, right down to how to keep yourself healthy and happy and avoiding injury and not getting infected by anything else. That was the micro, how to protect the individual. The macro was World War Z. How do you protect a nation? How do you protect a system from collapse? And that was the same philosophy I did with Zombie Survival Guide. You have a zombie threat. You're head of a country. How do you tackle it? How do you keep your public safe and not tip them over into panic? And then if you do tip over, how do you restore these systems? How do you feed people again? How do you get the factories running again? And then how do you respond with trade and travel? Because we are globalized. That was one of the key ideas of World War Z, because I wanted to attack America's greatest cultural weakness, which is isolationism. You know, every country, every culture has strengths and weaknesses. And our greatest weakness is isolationism. The idea that we just don't care. We don't care what's happening. You know, to us, the greatest time was the 1990s. We thought it was an era of peace and prosperity. Well, it was, unless you're a Rwandan, but who cares? That's America. And I wanted to make Americans see that what happens around the world will eventually come knocking at our door, no matter how much we stick our head in the sand. And so because of that, I wanted to show that Americans also have the greatest strength, which is adaptation. And that is very important. That's not just jingoism. That's not chauvinism. That's fact. Americans have a wonderful gift in that we can completely reinvent ourselves. And what is being an American in 1945 could not be any more different than being an American in 1914. So we have an ability to adapt to crisis, but you need to see that. And through a zombie plague, it's a great way of doing that.
I'm gonna turn it over to Dan Mahaffey in a moment. I know we have some questions coming in for the audience, and Dan's gonna field those. Can you just say something quickly about Devolution, when it's coming out, and sort of the subject matter there?
Devolution is, on the surface, it's just a Bigfoot attack novel. It's fun and it's scary, but what it's about is our interdependence on technology and our inability to take care of ourselves. The Devolution is about a very high-end, high-tech eco-community nestled in the Cascade Mountains. And these are not off-the-grid hippies. This is the grid. This is telecommuting. This is solar power. These are smart homes who, if anything breaks in the house, it sends a signal to the town and the handyman comes up in a driverless electric van. This is tapping on your phone to deliver your groceries. You get up, you telecommute to a meeting, then you go for a beautiful walk in the Cascade Mountains. What could be better than that? Technology has allowed us to live anywhere on this planet with the comforts of the Upper East Side of Manhattan until Mount Rainier erupts and all the connections are severed. And these highly paid, highly educated David Sedaris fans don't know how to change a light bulb. And winter is coming. And they have no tools and no skills. And if that's not bad enough, the eruption has also driven a pack of very large, very hungry Sasquatch creatures out of their traditional foraging ground. And they have come up against a pen of sheep. So these people who, up until the eruption, were at the top of the pyramid, enjoying all the fruits of society, are now at the bottom. And they are weak, and they are not only helpless, they are defenseless. And if they don't adapt, they will end up as someone else's food.
Exciting. Looking forward to that. All right, Dan, why don't we I know we have several questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to go ahead and bring in some audience questions.
Yes, we do. So you can use the chat Q&A function if you want to speak as well. Also, if you are able to raise your hand function, we can put you through on audio. If you are joining us on the phone, *9 will also show that you're raising your hand, so I can see that as well. So hit *9 if you're on the phone. But the first question I'm going to have here on the screen is from an anonymous attendee, talking about how in a real world there's the expending of resources and people on issues, accepting failure, handling high impact and low probability events, And how do you do that with politicians when their careers are on the line and how they respond and prepare?
I think it's the same thing in the issue is the same thing in the military. Is societies work by a system of rewards and punishments. That's just human civilization. That we've done this since we're coming out of the trees as hunter-gatherers. Certain behavior you reward and certain behavior you punish. And we have to start to reward the risk takers, even if they fail. In politics, I think you have to reward what I like to call the John McCain moment. That moment when that woman said Obama's an Arab. And McCain said, no, he's not. He's a decent and good man who just happens to disagree with me about the best way to take this country that we both love. Now, he might have lost the election, but he won the moral high ground. And shame on any public figure who did not rally around him and elevate him, because he should have been elevated. And he was by Colin Powell, who then went public and said, yeah, and what if he was an Arab? What's wrong with that? Was some little Muslim kid somewhere shouldn't think that they could become president of the United States? And what is this about small town values? I grew up in the South Bronx. Nothing wrong with my values. That's got to be a groundswell. In the military, I talk about the need for something called the Order of the Palm. And if anyone who's seen the movie Mr. Roberts knows that when Henry Fonda throws James Cagney's palm tree overboard, the crew gets together and they make him a medal. They reward this kind of courage. And we need to do that. We need to reward this kind of courage instead of shirking back and saying, better you than me. That's got to be critical, because if we don't change that, if we don't make it attractive, if we don't make it beneficial for throwing yourself on a grenade, then nobody's going to do it. The military understands that when it comes to courage. That's why they give medals for it. But if we don't do that in politics, if we don't reward the courageous politician who says the right thing, then they have no incentive to do so.
The next question I have is based on World War Z and how you laid out different cultures, responses, and adaptations in that. But building on that, how do you see our country now, where we seem very tribal in our approaches to things, responding to a cohesive threat or responding cohesively?
Well, I mean, we are very tribal, and I think that the tribalism is just cowardice on the part of our leadership, because there will always be hucksters. There will always be snake oil salesmen. And at this point, the most lucrative snake oil you can sell in America is hate. And we've seen this since the 1990s. You saw this with the rise of Rush Limbaugh on Fox News, where people who didn't even believe in this, and they will freely admit it. They will say, this isn't who I am. Alex Jones actually has said in his divorce trial, he said, this is a character that I play. But the product that he is selling, that Limbaugh, that Fox is selling, is hate. And it works. And it makes them a lot of money. And fine, let them do that. But if those in leadership positions don't push back on that and say, no, this is wrong. You might help me win a short-term election, but you're doing long-term damage to this country. That's the only way. There's only way to do. Obama did that. Obama did that when people tried to boo John McCain. And he said, no. We don't need that. We just need to vote. Now compare that to someone in the squad who allowed the audience to boo Hillary Clinton. That's wrong, because that's pandering to the darker side of American populism. And so we need less of that and more of Obama saying, no. And McCain saying he's a good and honorable man. So that's the only way, because there will always be those forces trying to make a buck by turning us against each other.
To follow on to that, this next question I think bridges into that, is when you are dealing with disinformation and using fiction to counter disinformation, and Washington Post talking about the Joe Scarborough murder allegation that's been driving social media right now. But you talk about the ego defense mechanism, the psychological condom, but even a book like 1984 right now seems to trigger how you respond one way or another. So how do you address that?
I think once again, you need to have leaders with the courage to risk their careers to stand up to the truth. 1984, my son is reading it right now. You need the artists to present these possible worlds. But then it is the responsibility of those in power to use their power to gain the trust of the public and to stand by it. And that's critical. And also, by the way, to hold those hate mongers accountable, because there's another way to make money off hate. We talk about Limbaugh and Fox News actively selling it, but then you talk about people who allow it to be sold, and that's social media. You talk about Zuckerberg, talk about Facebook, which says we will allow all political ads, and Twitter that says we will allow no political ads. Well, they're two sides of the same greed coin, because neither one of them wants to put out the money to hire vetters, and it can be done. And anybody that says it can't be done is lying. It just costs money, and they won't do it, and they must be held accountable, because that's why we have government. Government stands up for the people, and that's critical. I was at a meeting at the Atlantic Council where we had someone, I'm not going to say who, but he was from a previous administration who was transitioning from government to go work for Silicon Valley. And he actually said this about social media allowing Russian disinformation to come through. He said, hey, listen, we're just the carton. We're not responsible for the eggs. Well, I hope this is on the record, because I'll say it right now. That's bullshit. Everyone is responsible. Anyone in position of power is responsible for what they put into the world and must be held accountable.
I'm going to give the next question to Joshua Hubinski, who's raised his hand, but he'll go live on audio now.
Mr. Brooks, good morning. Thank you so much for doing this. It's an honor and fantastic to actually meet you. A huge fan of your work. Kathleen McGinnis in Foreign Policy writes, "Fiction is a frivolity unless it's a scene setter for a war game. We ask what is instead of what if." You've been an editor for Winning Westeros, Strategy Strikes Back, some fantastic books. How do we get these conceptual pieces into the policymaking and defense strategy to a degree where it's not just on the sidelines of being enjoyable and I wouldn't say escapist, but how do we get it to be more central to our planning feature?
Honestly, I keep going back to the word, which is courage, and the courage to not look foolish, because that's another one. You may not just be risking your career, your reputation. People don't like to look foolish, particularly men, and this has been proven psychologically. Most women are afraid of physical harm, but most men are afraid of humiliation. So much so, it is in the Geneva Convention. It's called outrages upon human dignity. Men don't like to look foolish. And so it takes a lot of guts for a general to stand up and talk about Star Wars, the lessons of Star Wars, the lessons of Star Trek. Thank God there was a major, now lieutenant colonel, named Matt Kavanaugh, who came up with this idea of Winning Westeros and of Strategy Strikes Back, and said, listen, when I talked to cadets, when I was on duty in Korea, Star Wars was our language. We all had seen these movies, and we could understand strategy through Star Wars. He said, let's write a book about it. Same thing with Game of Thrones. I think that pop culture, if done right, can be an amazing communicative tool. And by the way, it used to be. This is not new. This is old. This is every episode of Star Trek. This is every episode of Twilight Zone. I know many a soldier that is still reading Starship Troopers. That's how it used to be. So it's going to take a little bit of guts on the part of people with starched shirts and short haircuts, but also those people should reach out to Hollywood, because when we talk about arrogance and intellectual incest, there's nowhere worse than Hollywood. They know better. They think they know better, and they don't. They have the microphones, but they don't have the brains. Not anymore. They used to. And I know that by pitching stories to them. If they were to listen to people in government Listen to people in the military, not officially, not being forced, but just from people who are on the front lines, and say, listen, you have stories to tell and you can keep telling them, but put in a little bit of fact, make it valid, do a little bit of research, make it make sense, and you can educate the public. Because let me tell you, the enemy's doing that. That's why China is either trying to buy Hollywood hook, line, and sinker, or they are making their own movies. Anyone should see the movie Wolf Warrior 2 about the evil American contractors in Africa fighting the glorious PLA, saving their African brethren. What a great piece of propaganda. And we don't have to do propaganda because, as my former boss at the Modern War Institute said, it's not propaganda if it's true.
On the factors of truth and this idea of the post-truth world where you have those adversaries like Russia and China, not even putting out their own truth, but just sniping at the narrative to the point that you don't know what truth is, or breaking down the public's belief in traditional institution, arbiters of facts. How do you bolster that back up?
You have to bolster it by both sides coming together to defend these institutions. There is no way around that. When a politician attacks the press, not a reporter, not a story, but the press as an institution, there is a moral, patriotic duty of every elected official, of every political stripe, to come together and say, no, no. As a republic, the voters must hear the truth. And maybe it hurts me in the short term, but as an institution, the press must be defended. And that's critical, because too much has been, well, you're biased and you're not presenting the other side. No, no, no. There's no fair and balance. There's no two sides. There's the truth. And therefore, it is the duty of reporters to try to get to the truth, and politicians to try to defend that. That's it. The same thing with the FBI, the same thing with the intelligence services. Whenever a politician attacks those institutions as an institution, they must be shamed. They must be called out. There must be a spine. Otherwise, we're done.
Next question I have from Homer here, who's raised their hand. So I'll unmute yourself, Homer, and we'll ask away.
Sure, thanks very much. My question is, there's been a lot of pop culture and literature and film trying to address climate change in a way that would engage people and help them understand why action is needed, both politically and socially, and none of that seems to have taken root. So I'm wondering if you have a different kind of framing that you would suggest for that to be more effective.
Honestly, I think that with something like climate change, that's a tough one because it's long term. So people can't see it in the way they can see a pandemic, bodies piling up on the streets or wars or things like that. You've got to do it in a slow way. You've also got to do it in a smart way, because the problem is, if you hit people over the head, as we said, you trip the ego defense mechanism. People tune out. They go, oh God, another one of them. You also don't want to do it in a dumb way. And I won't call him out. Yeah, I will. The Day After Tomorrow. That movie was not only so in your face, it also wasn't accurate. That's not how global warming works. So when you have Jake Gyllenhaal literally running down a hallway being chased by the Ice Age, people laugh. And they should, because if you go too far and you stray too far from the facts in order to be sensationalist, you invite ridicule. And they did. They got a South Park episode where a beaver dam breaks and the town floods. They think it's global warming, and then they all panic and run into the rec center to get away from the global warming. So it's got to be smart. It's got to be subtle. It's got to be factual. And you don't have to attack it in your face. You can just put little bits head on. There was a great one. I can't remember what the name of the story. Maybe Bloodline. A family in Florida, Sissy Spacek, Sam Shepard, Kyle Chandler, Ben Mendelsohn. It wasn't about global warming. It was just about a really dysfunctional, murderous family. But at the very end, we realize the house that they've been fighting over eventually is going to be under 15 feet of water. That's a throwaway. They never even deal with that. That's just a fact. It's those little ones that you do. And I think those kind of things are important. Because by the way, in the 70s, we all thought there was going to be a horrible ice age. And there were some science fiction movies about that. There was even an In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy about the coming ice age. If you go too far, people will make fun of you and then they'll use it against you. The very same way my hippie science teacher in 8th grade said, well, fossil fuels will be gone by the end of the century. Said this in 1986. Don't lie, don't sensationalize. Just tell the truth in a way that doesn't smack you on both cheeks.
When it comes to politicians, and it's a follow-on to one of your earlier comments, and the courage, as you describe it, gets you a medal in the military. It doesn't always get rewarded by the party or the voters. And that in the information environment we have now, particularly internet and other technologies, does it make it in a way harder for politicians to hear what the public wants because it makes such a small segment sound so much louder or more influential than they are?
Yes, of course. Social media has allowed the fringe to believe that they are the mainstream and then take over the mainstream. So it makes the job incredibly harder. But I will say this, not for career civil servants, which, by the way, that's another institution. Anyone ever goes after career civil servants and attacks the deep state, there needs to be a tsunami of outrage from those who understand that it is this civil service that keeps us from dictatorship, this apolitical class of human beings, of patriotic Americans. But as far as trying to figure out what people want, yes, you have to cut through the BS of social media, and that's going to do a lot of extra work. But that's not impossible. And I will say this, as far as elected officials, and this is critical. I think it is important for elected officials to have a day job. And what I mean is, if you are coming from a real profession, and I'm saying something that you can go back to, then it doesn't just become about holding on. And I learned this from McCain's former chief of staff, who broke it down for me and said, listen, sometimes a lot of these politicians, they can't do anything else. They got nothing else. They got this. If they get voted out of office, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? I think if you have a class of leaders who are able to stand up and say, listen, I'm here to serve. And if you don't want my service, I will go back to my happy, lucrative private life. I think that gives them the courage. It's the same way that I have the courage to do what I'm doing right now and speak at the Atlantic Council and speak at the Modern War Institute. That's why they always bring me up, because I'm not one of them. I can speak truth to power. And my God, if I had a nickel for every time I go to Barry Pavel at the Atlantic Council after speaking and saying, do you want my badge and gun? Because I'm ready for every talk that I give to be my last. And I think that that's got to be on the mind of every elected official, is if you're not there to serve, if you're not there to bring people together and make their lives better, go get a day job, because there's plenty of them out there.
The next questions, and I'm going to, for time, kind of combine some of these and curate them, but the one talks about the divisions, the elites, the non-elites, urban versus rural, and also that comes to, some of that we've seen grow out of globalization and the impact of globalization and how that's going to change, perhaps in a post-pandemic world, its fragility revealed, as well as the divisions in society. How do you think we address some of those vulnerabilities and bridge those divisions?
Honestly, I think it really comes down to, you have to prove to people why they need government. You have to deliver something, because the problem is, the reason this pandemic is hitting us so hard is because the greatest generation is gone, mostly gone. It's like it's like my dad and Carl Reiner, I think, are all that's left. And the baby boomers are now America's elderly, and they grew up with everything. They grew up with vaccinations. They grew up with electricity and indoor plumbing and cars and great jobs. They take this for granted. We all take this for granted. Government has to prove its worth always, constantly. The Roosevelt administration understood that with the New Deal. Politicians have always understood this until recently. You know, this is why this election of 2016 went the way it did, because globalization had murdered the livelihoods of millions of Americans, and nobody was doing anything about it. Nobody. And there was lead in the water, and kids were being poisoned, and nobody was doing anything about it. And the American people went to one side and said, help us. And politicians said, well, we're working on it. We're going to talk about identity politics. What, who cares what your identity is? My kid is being poisoned by lead and I'm losing my house. And nobody would help them. And then they went to the other side, and the other side just promised them a time machine and just lied and said, hey, come with me. I'll bring you back to the good old days. Well, psychologically, people will take a lie over silence any day of the week. That's just basic human hearts and minds. If their choice is either indifference or a bright shining lie, they'll go for that. And so government has to deliver in material quality.
In the challenges we faced, climate, geopolitical, technological challenges, they're large issues. You have to break them down for the individual. They also don't always have a binary solution. It's not the Cold War, us versus them, or many shades of gray have to be addressed. Yes. How do you think you can get the public to grip the complexity of these, either through fiction, as you've described, or other ways that we can communicate?
Well, I mean, I think you have to make it personal. That's where stories come into play. You know, whether you like this president or not, he can tell a story and he can make it personal. And that's what good politicians do. You know, we've degraded this president for talking like a 3-year-old, but so did FDR. FDR broke down Lend-Lease as loaning your garden hose to your neighbor. Said your neighbor's house catches on fire. Well, I loan him my hose so the fire doesn't catch onto my house. And then when the fire's over, I want my hose back. Boom. Simple. Personal. That's what good stories do. That's how it works. Now, a lot of time when those stories are used for evil, they can move mountains. Unfortunately, one of the most famous American films ever made, Birth of a Nation. Look what it did, though. It was personal. But boy, when you talk about bringing back the Klan, it worked. Likewise, one of the greatest pieces of isolationist propaganda ever made, most people don't even know that it's that, which is Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz was all about Dorothy going on an adventure. And at the very end, there's no place like home. And she does that great monologue about like, hey, if I want something, I need not go farther than my own backyard. That's the isolationist talking in 1939 when this movie came out, saying, don't go to Europe. So whatever it is, global warming, globalization, the rise of this nouveau fascism that China has, where you can have prosperity without democracy, and they're trying to sell that all around the world. We need to educate the people on a very personal, basic level. And by the way, the good news about media, about entertainment now, is that it is fragmented. Is that instead of everybody gathering around the TV to watch Seinfeld, everybody's watching their own shows now. We can now tailor make these shows to people's personal hopes and dreams and getting the bigger messages out in a very small way.
The final question I'm going to look at, we have from our audience here, is one of them is teaching a course on dystopian politics this fall, and wants to know what you would say shorter works, stories, poems, even TV episodes that we can think about when we want to relate lessons about these dystopias.
Sure. I'll tell you the greatest story ever done, Dawn of the Dead by George A. Romero. It's a zombie movie. And no matter whatever I've written on zombies, I ain't got nothing on George. Because what George did in 1970s was describe how a zombie pandemic would start and how truly weak the zombies are and how easily defeatable they are. What he did was outline the failures of individuals and institutions and showing how society can collapse. And he took it step by step, explaining what happens when people lose faith in society, in each other, in our leaders, and in themselves. There's nothing better. If you want to see societal collapse, it is Dawn of the Dead.
Great. Well, thank you, audience, for your questions. Thank you, Max, for answering them. And I'll turn it back over to Glenn.
Max, we had more questions than we could get to today, but I just want to say there's a lot of interest in this topic. Obviously, you've touched a nerve here, and you've really connected well and diagnosed for us, probably in a slightly different way than we're used to saying it, but really diagnosed for us quite accurately the challenges of governance of our society, of trying to chart a better path forward for our politics so that it is accountable and answerable and delivers real value. The center was founded 55 years ago around this idea and has been working at this ever since. You know, people ask me how we're doing on this challenge of solving, you know, the relationship between the presidency and Congress and delivering value from the federal government back to the people. Sometimes they say it with a chuckle, but it is a seriously challenging mission. And I appreciate you helping us unpack, you know, some of the reasons why it's hard. You talked a lot about incentive systems and diagnosing the cost of hate speech and other things that we see so commonly now in politics that actually ends up working. It keeps people in office, unfortunately. And one of the things that we're trying to accomplish at the center is to unwind that system of incentives, to tinker away at where we can. And let's be honest, it's a big network of challenges. So we focused on a few areas that we think we can have some impact on. The systemic areas of the election systems, for example, things that tend to reward the wrong behaviors, where, you know, with a little bit of reform, we think we can bend the curve to have those systems more accurately incentivize delivery of that value back to the citizen. And we think that's it's a worthy goal and something that we're trying to accomplish every day. So I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you coming and helping us think through that a little bit more. You gave us some great new ideas. I'm sure you've energized the group here to redouble our efforts because, you know, it's the challenge of our time. So Max Brooks, thank you so much for your creative work, for helping us understand how you've started to, you know, penetrate some of these ideas into the public mind, getting around that ego defense, and entertaining us in the process. So we really appreciate you joining us today, Max. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Take care. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye-bye.